So I want to start out this morning by telling you about two different neighborhoods in a port city in Japan. The port city is called Kobe in Japan. The two neighborhoods are Mano and Makuta. Now, these two neighborhoods in that same city are very similar to each other. By the numbers, they look very similar. They have similar average incomes of their residents. The demographics are similar. And so you would think that in a natural disaster, these two neighborhoods, which are so similar, would have similar trajectories of recovery. But they didn't. So in 1995, a massive earthquake struck Kobe, Japan, during the night. Now, Kobe, Japan is a large city, and over 6,000 people died in this earthquake, and 10,000 buildings were destroyed, and many fires broke out after the earthquake. And the two neighborhoods fared very differently. Makuta turned to ash. But in Mano, a few structures were damaged, but they recovered much more quickly. So what's the difference? What's the difference between these two neighborhoods who have the same infrastructure, the same fire departments, the same response systems? What's the difference between Makuta, which turned to ash, and Mano, which recovered fairly quickly? Here's some evidence of the difference. In Makuta, the one that turned to ash, when the fires started breaking out in the night, people went out in their front yards in their pajamas and watched their neighbors' fires burn and waited for the authorities to come. In Mano, people didn't wait for the fire department. They got out of their houses and they worked together to run hoses like all the way from factories into the residential district and formed impromptu bucket brigades to put out the fires. And most of their homes did not turn to ash. So they had the same city infrastructure, but they had very different social infrastructure, Makuta and Mano. In Mano, the families, they had family businesses, was the most common kind of business. And those businesses were owned by people who were neighbors to each other. And they would trade back and forth. They knew how to go to their neighbor with a need and ask for help, and they knew how to reach out to one another. And years earlier, they had banded together to save one of their natural resources from development, long before the earthquake. The people who lived in Mano learned that their neighbors were good people who were willing to help. They learned that things could change, that they could stop the process of development for their own good. They knew how to ask for each other's help and how to give help and how to receive help, and that made all the difference. Makuta had a much more normal culture for our modern world. They likely had a much more cynical view of their neighbors, a lack of relationships, a lack of social infrastructure, a lack of trust that things could be any different than the outcome that seemed to be immediately before them. So psychologist Jamil Zaki talked about these two neighborhoods in the port city of Kobe, Japan. He talked about this in a conversation with Shankar Vedantam on the Hidden Brain podcast. Jamil is an empathy researcher. And he defines cynicism this way. Cynicism is a fixed negative belief that people are inherently greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy. Cynicism is a fixed negative belief, and applied to human relationships, the fixed negative belief is that people are inherently greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy. How does that sit with you? Does that resonate with like maybe some of your own life experiences? That people are inherently greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy. Dr. Zaki has done an incredible amount of research on cynicism and the impact that it has on our work, on our relationships, and even on outcomes like net worth. Super interesting. I'd highly recommend this Hidden Brain podcast with Jamil Zaki. So cynicism is growing in prevalence, especially among the younger generations. There was a statistic in the podcast that among 18-year-olds, so people who are just graduating from high school and embarking on adult life, it was something like only 18% of those 18-year-olds disagreed with the statement that most people are greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy. So only 4 out of 5 people agreed that people are mostly greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy. And one of the ways that Zaki attributes this, one of the reasons that he states, is that parents are teaching their children that the world is a dangerous place in order to keep them safe. And we're inadvertently fostering cynicism by teaching them that the world is dangerous. Now, what I know about cynical people is that often cynical people, they'll say that they hate being cynical and then they wish they weren't that way, but they also kind of love being cynical. And it's like an indulgence, like it feels really good to be cynical, to go into that place of just writing people off because people are greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy. Some people even take cynicism like it's a moral imperative. Like, in order to be a good person, you have to be cynical. That even if it doesn't feel good, being cynical is our calling as moral people. So, of course, to pay attention to injustice, to not let bad things be invisible, is a moral imperative. But the truth is that it does not help our kids or our communities. Because cynicism is also dangerous. It's also dangerous because cynicism, the lasting negative belief about people and about the future, closes in the possibility that anything could be better. When we're cynical, we close the door on the possibility that anything could be better. And it's often a tool of the status quo. All right, so back to Makuto and Mano for a second, and then we'll go into our story for today. So between Makuto and Mano, which neighborhood do you think is closest to the shape of the kingdom of God? The one where neighbors helped each other, or the ones where neighbors watched homes being burned down? Which one is closer to the church? That's a trickier question, or maybe what the church should be. Today we turn to the story of Tabitha. Tabitha lives in another port city named Joppa in the ancient world. And what happens in Tabitha's story shows this incredible lack of cynicism. There is no cynicism in the community that Tabitha is a part of, and with Peter either. When something tragic happens, they come together. When something tragic happens, they have an imagination to consider that things might be different than what they are. So if you've got your crossword, kids, now's the time to listen up. If you have a pen or pencil, that may have been an oversight. If you don't have a pen or pencil, it's going to be hard to figure it out. But follow along as we hear the story of Tabitha. This is from Acts chapter 9, verses starting at verse 36. Now in Joppa, there was a disciple whose name was Tabitha, which in Greek is Dorcas. I know, it's tragic name. Tabitha's better. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. At that time, she became ill and she died. When they washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. All right, so let's stop there for a second. She was devoted to good works and acts of charity. What I hear here is a cue to something about the social infrastructure. Like, remember the social infrastructure of the town of Manu, the neighborhood of Manu, where people helped each other, where they knew they could turn to their neighbors. There's something with these Tabitha's good works and charity, or kindness and generosity, if you're in the words of the Peace Table story, that there's something there, that people are helping one another. So she became ill and she died. They washed her, they laid her in a room upstairs. All right, picking it up at verse 38. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples who heard that Peter was there sent 2 men to him with the request, "Please come to us without delay." Please come to us without delay. So we've got 2 towns now, Lydda and Joppa. Joppa is the port city, Lydda is a neighboring city, and Peter was in Lydda. So this is pretty much immediately after Pentecost, where the Holy Spirit came down and people heard the good news in their own language. Peter was there. He preached a very long, but apparently very powerful sermon. And the believers spread. They added all kinds of people to their number, people who believed in the good news of Jesus, and then they went out. So Peter went from Jerusalem, where Pentecost happened, to Lydda. And there was a group of disciples in Lydda where Peter healed a man named Aeneas. And so apparently the news got out that Peter was in Lydda and that Peter had some sort of power to heal people. And what we need to know about this community of people in Joppa is that they were likely Gentiles. Joppa was a port city, which means that people from all over the world were coming and going. And because the book of Acts gives her Greek name, the name Dorcas, we can reasonably conclude that Tabitha, Dorcas, is a Gentile. Now you remember the difference between Jews and Gentiles. Like, for Jews, anyone who's not Jewish, anyone who's a Gentile is like seen to be unclean. They cannot come in contact, Jews cannot come in contact with Gentiles. They have to stay away. If they accidentally come in contact with a Gentile, there's all this ritual stuff they have to go through to make themselves clean again. Peter is a Jew, Tabitha, likely a Gentile, part of likely a mixed community or a Gentile community. So Peter's in Lydda, having just healed Aeneas, and these 2 strangers come to him. 2 strangers come to him and say, "Please come with us without delay." Now, Peter doesn't know who these people are. If you were a cynical person, if Peter was a cynical person, how would he have responded to the request, "Please come to us without delay," with no further details? If you're a cynical person who believes that people are greedy, dishonest, and untrustworthy, would you go with them? No. Peter appears to not have any cynicism in him. So he goes. Now remember the pre-existing belief that Peter had about Gentiles. And he's going to this place with something unknown, which likely has a lot of Gentiles. And he had not yet had the vision of the clean and unclean animals together, where God told him, "Do not call unclean what I have made clean." That came next. So Peter got up and he went. Peter had the courage to imagine something other than the preconceived notions that he had. All right, verse 39. So Peter got up and went with them. And when he arrived, they took him to the room upstairs. I love this part. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was with them. Peter's standing in this room, and all of a sudden all these ladies come around him, showing him this stuff that Dorcas, Tabitha, had sewed for them. And here you see that social infrastructure again. Widows were like the most vulnerable people in society. But widows were apparently part of this community through Tabitha's work, through her kindness and her generosity. They had a place in a community. They had enough clothes also to be wearing clothes and to be carrying clothes, which is a significant sign of being okay in the world. You're less on the edge of disaster if you have enough clothes to be wearing clothes and carrying clothes. And they're weeping around Peter. Probably some of them Gentiles. Can you imagine what this is like for Peter? I've been in a room many times. I've been in rooms with a family or group community of people after their loved one has died. And people either let you in or they don't. I mean, as a chaplain, you're often a stranger, not so much as a minister. I was a healthcare chaplain before we were here. Families either let you in or they don't. Either death has come and there's nothing we can do about it, we just accept it, we close the doors on our hearts, and we move on to the tasky things that have to come next. There's no role for a chaplain in that situation. They either let you in or they don't. Sometimes families will let you in. And the storytelling that happens in those moments is incredible. Stories of reasons that they loved this person who has just died. The tears often pour out, and there is some kind of healing that happens with people who let in a minister or a chaplain in that moment. And this community let Peter in. Now you notice they don't ask Peter to do anything. They don't ask Peter to do anything. They're just sharing their stories. But it's sharing their stories somehow is enough to prompt Peter to do something. But they don't ask him to do anything. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So verse 40, picking it up at verse 40. Peter put them all outside, and then he knelt down and he prayed. He turned to the body and said, "Tabitha, get up." Then she opened her eyes, and seeing Peter, she sat up. And listen to this. He gave her his hand and helped her up. Not only a Gentile, but also a woman who apparently was just dead, which is also an unclean thing. Peter gives her his hand. Now, continuing the second half of verse 41. Then calling the saints and widows, he showed her to be alive. This became known throughout Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. Meanwhile, Peter stayed in Joppa for some time with a certain Simon, a tanner, which is where Peter has this vision with the unclean and clean animals coming down. So, turning away from cynicism or being absent of cynicism opens all kinds of doors in Tabitha's community and for Peter. What could be true? What could be different about our lives if we had that same kind of absence of cynicism? Dr. Zaki poses an alternative to cynicism, which he calls hopeful skepticism. Hopeful skepticism. Now, when I said before about cynics often like really loving being cynics, like deep down, I find that cynics, and sometimes I'm one of them, they're prideful about not being naive. They take comfort and security in knowing that nobody's going to pull the wool over my eyes. But what Dr. Zaki is suggesting here is not naivete. It's not naive optimism or blind optimism. So with cynicism we have, things will never get better. This is all that we can expect. Blind optimism says things will get better. And like whenever somebody says that things will get better, I'm like, probably not. But then there's hopeful skepticism, which says things could get better. Things might get better. It might not end up this way. Things could get better. That's the alternative to things will never get better or things will definitely get better, is things could get better, is just having the door open to the possibility that things could get better. Isn't that what Peter did? This idea that maybe seeing this beautiful community of grieving widows, like maybe things could get better. He opened himself to the possibility that God could do something. And isn't that true also of Tabitha's friends? She died. Like, that was over. But they were like, They didn't have the courage to even name the possibility of her being raised from the dead. But they were open to the possibility that things could change. Hopeful skepticism, Dr. Zaki introduces it as an alternative worldview to cynicism and blind optimism. And there's three things that he suggests, three sort of practices of hopeful skepticism. One is an openness to evidence. An openness to evidence. And as a psychologist, this makes sense. As a person with a scientific viewpoint, it makes sense. Don't seek proof only of what you already know to be true, but be open to evidence of the otherwise. Evidence that things could be different. Like Peter saying, maybe the Gentiles aren't actually dirty and unclean, and maybe I don't need to keep myself away from them. Be willing to see things that challenge your assumptions. So openness to evidence. The second one, recognize your negative bias. Recognize your negative bias. Like name it, like, oh, there's that cynical part of me again. Name it and learn to recognize it in yourself. This idea that things will never get better. I mean, we all have that voice in it. So learn to recognize it and recognize it as only one voice within you. And then be willing to expect pleasant surprises. Expect pleasant surprises. Zaki has a personal way that he does that. He realized as a parent that in his effort to sort of warn his kids about the dangers of the world, he would often share with his kids stories about how people had in fact been greedy and dishonest and untrustworthy. Like he had an experience out in the world of someone trying to screw him over. He went home and told his kids about it. And he started to realize that that was the dominant narrative that he was telling his kids about outsiders, about people out in the world. And so he started a practice of pleasant surprises and naming pleasant surprises with his kids. When somebody did something small that changed his day, he made an intention of telling his kids about it. And that kind of put up this radar, he says, a radar of like noticing the goodness in the world. And the more he started to tell his kids about it, the more he saw it, and it started to change him, to lower his cynicism, his expectation that people will be greedy and dishonest and untrustworthy. And here's the thing that he says, is that when you expect people to be greedy and dishonest and untrustworthy, that's what you'll see. There's a bias in our brain that makes us look for that. People being greedy and untrustworthy. It's a learned behavior, and we can unlearn it and be open to something different. So we need to talk before we close about this resurrection from the dead thing. There are lots of reasons not to believe in the resurrection from the dead. And maybe this fixed negative belief that resurrection from the dead, maybe it could be called cynicism. It's a barrier to people in believing the Bible. Being able to say they believe the Bible is, I don't believe in the resurrection of the dead, or in being able to believe Jesus. And there's lots of reasons for that. The belief that death is the end and will only ever be the end. But the natural consequence of cynicism is isolation. When you believe nothing will ever be different, you go inward and you close the doors on your heart, and then nothing will be different. And I think too often Christians need to take the leap from cynicism to blind optimism, to saying, this does happen, this definitely did happen, and doubling down on it in a naive kind of way, which is a step too far for many of us with a scientific mind. I find my way into believing in the resurrection of the dead through hopeful skepticism. Through hopeful skepticism. And I think that's what Tabitha's community and Peter did too. They didn't say God will raise Tabitha from the dead. They didn't say that. They don't even call on God. The community, Tabitha was called a disciple in the story, so presumably she has some beliefs about Jesus, and her fellow Joppians do too. But they don't call on God, they call on Peter. Like, we don't know what God can do, but this Peter guy, he seems to be doing some amazing things. Maybe seems to be their posture. Maybe Peter. We need Peter here to do something. They don't even dare to give voice to the hope that she could be raised from the dead. And it's not clear what Peter does either. It's not clear in the text that Peter believes that God could raise Tabitha from the dead. We don't know what he prays. It just says in the text that he prayed. He prayed. He doesn't have this cynical attitude that death is the end and that's all that will ever be, but neither does he say, okay, God, time to raise Tabitha from the dead because that is what you do. He doesn't go to either place. He just seems to open his heart to the fact that God is there and God could do something. Hope is a fiery and radical emotion. Fiery and radical that keeps us in this radical in-between space, between the ditches of blind optimism and cynicism. What are we missing out on because of our cynicism? I think in some Christian communities, Christian communities tend to fall into either ditch, either like cynical, and lots of liberal Christians seem to find themselves in that spot, completely cynical about all this supernatural stuff, or blind optimism. Lots of other Christian communities find themselves in like, God will do this, and they're not at all honest about when God doesn't do it. I don't know. Which one are we? I think we're somewhere in between. I think we have some of both in our midst. What if we leaned into hopeful skepticism? The possibility that things could be different. The possibility that inviting someone in, like Tabitha's community invited Peter, that inviting someone in might change something. What difference would it make if we held out the possibility that God could change things? That the way things are doesn't need to be the way that things stay. If we don't expect that, we create all kinds of barriers to what God might do. So, what are you cynical about today? What are you feeling cynical about today? The state of the world? A relationship? A place where you feel stuck? What are you cynical about? That you think it could never get better? What evidence can you look for to the contrary? And can you name that cynical voice as the cynical voice and recognize that there are other voices as well? And what could happen if you started to expect pleasant surprises? What might God resurrect in our midst if we could be open to the possibility? Will you join me in prayer? God, thank you so much for the story of Tabitha and for the many people whose lives were changed because of her kindness and generosity in her life and the incredible story of her resurrection. We confess to you our cynicism. We confess to you our blind optimism. And we pray that you'll help us to keep the door to possibility open, even if it's just a crack. That your Spirit might squeeze through that crack